you guys, welcome back to my channel. Today we are going to be doing another real-time portrait sketch, and this time we're drawing Honey from New Jeans. The pencils that I'm going to be using are two different kinds, one from Artix and it's just a regular 5B pencil, and the other one is my Mars Lumograph one just for the darker parts, and I will show you guys why later when we get to that. I'm also drawing on my Canson watercolor paper, but any paper will do. I just have this one because it's the size that I want for this drawing. Outside of that, any paper would have done for this little sketch. So we are starting off with the Loomis Head, and to start it off we're just gonna go with a sphere or a circle for the very round part of the head. This is just the top part. This doesn't include the face when we try to imagine that. And then the side of the head will have this flat area where it looks like a ball is sliced off on the sides, and so we want that in our drawing as well. I'm also going ahead and putting a cross in there just so we can really see that this is a flat surface, and then we are extending that over to the rest of the sphere, and that will be the center part of this initial ball for the skull. And we're going to do another line, this time starting from the bottom of that flat circle, and we're going to do another one for the top part of that flat circle. So this is now basically the top part of the skull. In order for us to draw the rest of the face and the jaw, what we're going to do is add the same length as these divisions in this circle. So basically we're just adding a fourth line that is the same distance as the three that we already have, and this will give us a good baseline on how long the face will be. And like I always said, this is just a basic model for a face. As we go along, we're going to adjust a few things, but for now what we're going to do is roughly draw the jaw by connecting that line over to our initial sphere, and on the other side we're going to connect it to the bottom of our flat surface. So that will leave us with enough space for the ear, which we're just going to draw in the bottom of this flat side of her head, starting from the center of that cross and then going down. And the positioning of the neck, we're going to base a lot on the photo, which for here is just below this ear, and on the other side is just to the right of her chin. So after that, what I'm going to draw is actually the big color on her coat, because it's a very distinctive factor in the drawing, and I just want to have space for that later, and I want to be able to place that on the photo. So I'm putting that in right now. But after that, we're going to start with her actual features, and we're starting off from her nose, and we just go from that line that is extended from her ear and then go to the next line on top. And again, this is disregarding any individuality of her nose. We just want to have a good placeholder for it so we can know where to place the rest of the features. And then the next line is going to be her eyebrows, and we're just going to place it there sitting on that line. And I've just extended that circle down to her chin just so I can see the very front plane of her face before I start drawing in her eyeball. And I'm just placing it under her eyebrow right here, making sure that it's the same distance from her nose, and also making note that the left one is going to be closer to her nose while the other is going to be further out just from the angle. And then I want to have a good midway point between her nose and her chin for the mouth line. And as far as how wide it is, I'm just also going to base it off of the length of her nose, just off to the side, almost going to the center of her eyeball. And then to start the rough drawing of her hair, I'm making sure that I'm making note of where she parts her hair. In Honey's case, she has it right at the center, so I'm using that center line of her scalp and drawing her hair as big shapes first. The only thing I'm making note of at this point is where it's going from her head, and where she's parting it is also where I'm starting my lines, and where it looks like it's blooming out of that part. This is actually a very crucial part of the portrait, almost as much as her features. You can see right here at her neck, I want it to look more full. And then for her little ponytail, for now we're going to make it this big shape. I think the important part is the negative space around it. Okay, so now that we have all of her features placed in our head, and so when we go from her eyes, what I've recently started doing is starting with the corners of her eyes and pointing them out so I can make them more uniform. And then what I do is just connect them and making sure that we are making note of how that connecting line is curved around the sphere that is the eyeball. And we're going to do the same thing to the upper eyelid. For this photo, the sort of the tipping point of that curve on her eye is to the side, and so we're making sure that we're really getting that slope right. And most of it is because of the angle that we're looking at it from. But then after that, I'm just going to draw very roughly her eyebrow. I think her eyes are good for now, so what we're going to do is move on to her nose. The first thing I really like to do is get this very center, sort of round part of the nose right. It really sets a tone for how the nose will look, and so I just will have that very center of the point of her nose first before I draw in her nostrils on the sides. And then for the rest of her nose, we're just going to draw them very lightly. We're making note of how the bridge looks. If there are any curves on her nose, we want to get that right. I'm supposed to use very light lines for this just so I can adjust it later. But for now, we're going to move on to her lips. And before we really start drawing it, I want to make points from where her nose ends and where the top of her lip starts, and do the same thing from where her chin ends and the bottom lip starts, just so I can have enough space for both and I'm not making the lips too big. And also when I'm drawing the mouth, I always start from where the center of her lips are. You can see it's sort of curved down into this bow shape at the center, and then I'll have other points towards the side before I connect them. And also her smile line is very recognizable, so I'm trying to get that as much as I can. I'm also just then connecting the corner points to the center. Just make sure that this is a light. I like to shade in the lips more than I like to outline them. And before we move on, I just want to make her eye lines a little bit smaller because I think it was too big before, and also just cut off this corner on the right one before we really start to carve out the silhouette of her face. And again, while we are following the guideline that we've put in underneath for the Loomis Head, at this point we're very much relying on the photo and how the curves are falling on her. You can see her cheeks are a little bit fuller, and also it goes more pointy towards the chin, and I'm going to make sure where on the chin it goes in. And for her, it's just under the lip right here, and her neckline also goes straight before it goes back up to her jaw. I really just want to make sure we're following those lines on our drawing. I also just wanted to draw in her ear right here so I don't forget it, because I have a bad habit of doing that. Just following the lines that I see on her ear really. Before I draw in her irises, and when I do this, I just like to make note of how much of the whites of the eyes are left, so that we can really see where she's looking and we can really copy that kind of angle that we're looking at it from. And also just darkening up her eyebrows right here. I think before it was just too messy. And now what we're going to do is try to draw in these big clumps of her hair first before we start with the shading. And over here, like before, it helps to imagine these as less like hair strands and just more like clumps that are going out of her head. Just so it's very flowy. It takes up a lot of space, just like how I like it in my sketches. And then once we have that, we are now going to start with the shading. What I've done for mine is get a kneaded eraser and just tap it onto the sketch just so I can take out some of my darker lines. You can also do this with your regular eraser. Just make sure that you're not taking out all of the lines that we just put in. We're more like evening the values before we can really start to build it up again. Before I start to really shade, I'm just mapping out the highlights on her face, and these are just going to be the areas that we want to avoid when we do our shading. And we also just want to extend it to her hair. And as you can see, I am holding my pencil towards the end so that I'm not putting in too much pressure on it, and I'm just going at basically the whole thing except for the highlights that we've mapped out. I'm just scratching along my paper, and again, these are very light. You might want to follow sometimes the curves of her hair and some of the shadows that are falling on her neck, but the general idea is to just start it off with an even layer of shading throughout most of this drawing. And I'm just leaving out the highlight for her color right here because I really like the shape of it. And then we're gonna move on to her face. You see I'm being more careful with her face right here. On her nose, I've added this extra highlight right here so that I don't accidentally go over it. But really for most of this, the main thing to remember is to just keep it very light. I have a very light grip on it, and it's towards the bottom of that pencil just so it's not too dark. And then I want to have just these extra lines that are a little bit darker just so I can separate the darkest shadows on her. I'm mostly just focusing it on her neck and her hair. And this is just the slightest bit more pressure than we started with initially. This is still very light. I don't know if that shows that much on video, but I'm not adding too much force to my sketch at this point still. I'm more like separating the elements of the sketch for now, separating her hair from her face and her neck from her clothes, just things like that. We're not thinking too much about the details at this moment because what we're gonna do after is just blend it out, those initial laydown of shadows. And for me, I'm just using my finger, and I know I'm not supposed to use that, but this is just a sketch and this is what I do. You can use those paper blenders if you have them, but since I don't, I just really went over it with my finger. Don't do that if you're trying to preserve it because the oils on your hand are going to be really bad. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is trace out the darkest lines of the sketch, and I had to use my Mars Lumograph pencil for this one because on video, my drawing ended up being lighter than how it is in person because of how reflective my pencil was. But in theory, you can really just use the same pencil for this. Just needed to make sure that it was showing on camera that I was using a little bit more pressure on my pencil so I can get darker lines for this part of the drawing. So you can see I'm starting from her eyes. I really just wanted to get the shape of her eyes right. Honey's eyes are very distinctive, and so I wanted to get that, especially that slope towards the corner. I also drew her upper eyelids very close to her lashes, but I don't think hers really showed that well in the photo, so I could have just skipped this. Then we're darkening up her eyebrows a bit. And then her nostril, I just wanted to get this darker too before we shape out her nose, which we kind of lost when I blended the initial shadows on her. So we're putting back some structure to it, and the same to her lips too. And we're just going to slowly build up the shadows as we go on. You see right here, I'm separating her neck from her collar, and then also going back to her eyes and slightly drawing in her lashes while shading in her irises and making sure that her pupils are the darkest. But after that, we are taking our pencil and building up the shadows and the values of her hair. I've sort of added in her bangs, but really to just see how her forehead will look once we've added that in. We're still not too focused on the details right now. We're just looking at how the shadows are falling on her hair and where we should be concentrating those shadows. Also making sure that her hair is much darker than her face before I move on to these little hair strands and these very dark shadows near and above her ear that shapes it out. I want to be able to have that before we go on to adding these darkest values on her hair that are towards her nape. And again, we're just making note of the movement of her hair and how it is going from her scalp. Right here on her ponytail should be the darkest because the hair is more concentrated. And then we draw it spilling out of that ponytail so there's more volume after. You can just see that I'm adding some of that shading towards most of her hair. For the very center, I made sure that that line is very clearly put in there. And also when I'm shading in the rest of her head, that I'm still following where her hair is flowing with the movement of my pencil. And then we're repeating the process towards the rest of the drawing. So I'm doing the same thing to her collar versus her hair right here, where instead of outlining her collar, we're drawing the shadows around it very dark so we can see that the lines on the collar of her coat is very crisp. So we want to carve it out instead of outlining it. And then I also just wanted to add more volume to her bangs right here. And so after that, we're just gonna shade in her lips. And I'm making sure that I'm never shading it too dark. I'm slowly building it up. I want to be able to see her mouth line and how she's actually smiling. So if I make her lips too dark, we wouldn't be able to see that. So you see I'm really shading it very, very light. And we're gonna do the same thing for her nose. We're slowly just adding shadow to the top of that highlight we've had in, and do the same thing for the shadow under her nose. And then her eye bags too, very slowly again, almost just outlining it with very light shading. This one that I'm doing for the corner of her lip would have been fine, but I think I just made it too dark right here, just a tiny bit. And the one at the bottom where it curves out, this one is definitely too dark. I think after this, I erase that slowly. But again, it's better to go too light with your shading right now than make it too dark, because you could always build it up if it's too light. Yeah, that's what I'm doing right now. I'm also doing the same thing for her neck. This part is actually the slowest part because I wanted to get the lines of her face right, but then I didn't want them to be too dark. There are some points where I use my regular eraser to just tighten up the lines that I've put in whenever I needed to. But yeah, this is really the point where there's the most adjustment that was needed in the drawing. And the best thing to do here is to evaluate where your sketch is at and really to try and step back and see if some of these lines are even needed, because sometimes it's hard to see when you've been staring at the drawing for so long. Yeah, at some point I did just go ahead and draw the lashes on her eyes too. Before I went back to look at the full drawing again to see that the values are right with the rest of it and not just on her face. So first we're getting the lines on her coat right, and we're making sure that the shadows between them are dark enough before also just lightly drawing in the folds of her coat. Again, these are very light. We just want to make sure that we're conveying that differences in texture versus her face and her hair. Some areas right here, I just wanted to make it look very dark so that we can see that it's in shadow. But really, I'm not drawing specific things. More like just adding shadow so we can really see her shoulders. But yeah, these shadows are very light. You just want to add enough so that it looks like there's form on them before we really move on to the darkest final details. So I've just sharpened up my pencil, and you can see I'm using it now to add the darkest lines on her, and I really wanted to focus out on her eyes. And again, because her eyes are so distinctive and they're also very expressive, and so I want to get that light on her eyes right, and how it's sort of squinted. I want to get that kind of shape right too, because before with the very similar values you couldn't really see that. So that's what I'm doing right now. I'm making sure I'm almost exaggerating everything and focus that on her eyes. And we're gonna do the same thing for her hair. Wherever we see that there's a very dark hair strand or a shadow that's falling on hair strands, we wanna get that right, so that the rest we can just add in as very tiny details. I'm also just adding those lines, those darker lines on her nose and her lips as well. And it really just goes for all of the drawing. Wherever there is a particularly dark shadow, you want to exaggerate that so it sort of carves out the rest of the drawing. This is also when I'm slowly starting to add in individual hair strands, especially on her bangs right here. But again, it's more important to add in these darkest shadows wherever we can see them, because they really are what brings the whole thing together. You see, whenever I'm drawing hair, I always start from where they are the darkest, like on her ponytail right here. Start from where they are clumped together, because that will be where they are the darkest, and then slowly just spread out towards the rest of the hair. Sometimes the shadows might not even look very natural. Like over here, it looks like that shadow of her hair looks too carved out. But again, it's more like a stylistic choice. I want most of her hair to look like in shading. It also look like it's not just individual hair strands. And this is where I think style goes into it, because especially on the hair, I like it to look more full, and so that's why I focus more on the form when I'm shading before I start in the hair strands. You can see right here, I'm again focusing those dark areas towards the center where it should be the darkest, and really create that separation between the parts of her hair. I know it's very far out from where we're looking at it from, but just leaving out that strip of highlight where her hair is parted really just makes it look more right. Also, we're doing the same thing to this ponytail on the other side, which I've sort of neglected before because it's in shadow, and so that's why I'm just slowly adding in more hair strands to that area. But again, because this whole area is in shadow, I've mostly just focused on building up those shadows rather than adding in more details. I also don't want to take away from the details on her face, and that's why a lot of my more finer details are focused on top, like her hair and her face. Her hair at the bottom sort of fades out in detail, and the same thing goes for the whole sketch in general. But yeah, that is actually it for this one. Thank you guys for watching. Thank you to my patrons for supporting me, and I will be seeing you guys again soon. Happy holidays!